Coming up on this Jerusalem Dateline, we travel to Mount Gerizim to hear the latest on Palestinian terror threats and how the IDF is protecting Israeli citizens living on the Gaza border. Plus, Christian media giants gather in Jerusalem for the annual Christian Media Summit. And Iran sparks international outrage with its public executions of protesters. And an Israeli musician writes worship music for the persecuted church in Iran. All this and more on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell, coming to you from Mount Gerizim in Samaria, overlooking Nablus, referred to in the Bible as Shechem. We're here to highlight Palestinian terror groups currently threatening Israel's security. Here's an interview we did with Joe Truzman from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Tell us, how would you assess the status of the West Bank right now?
The status of the West Bank is, unfortunately, of conflict, especially in the last year and a half. Militant organizations such as Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades have established themselves in the northern West Bank and have been launching attacks against Israeli citizens, Israeli troops, and Israeli settlements.
And what role does the Palestinian Authority play in what's happening right now?
It's actually a pretty huge role. What's going on is that the Palestinian Authority has lost its influence over the years in areas such as the northern West Bank. And what's happened is that these Palestinian militant organizations have filled in the vacuum that's been left by the PA. And what's happening is that they've been expanding, and by expanding, they've been able to launch these attacks against Israeli targets.
And what role is Iran and Hamas playing in this vacuum?
It's a huge role. Their goal is to destabilize the West Bank. It's in their interest to do that. And they are undermining the Palestinian Authority. What they're also doing is supporting these groups such as Palestinian Islamic Jihad, for example, or Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. And what's happening again is we're seeing this huge increase in violence over the last year and a half.
And you've got a tool there at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, an interactive map. Tell us about it.
So what we have done, we've taken data from local media, we've taken data from IDF statements and claims by militant organizations, and we've put it together in this visual, and which describes and shows, or illustrates rather, all the violence that's been happening since at least late March of this year. And it's very impressive as far as you can really see all of the shooting attacks and everything that's been happening in the past year and a half here. It's unfortunately, it's very sad to see, but it's reality.
And tell us, what can the IDF do to prevent these proliferation of attacks?
They have launched Operation Breaking the Wave since late March, which has been effective, but I think a closer cooperation with the Palestinian Authority is needed here. The Palestinian Authority needs to step up and fill in this vacuum that they've lost, essentially, and suppress these militant organizations, because it's been causing a lot of problems for a year and a half now.
Yeah, and what do people need to know in the States or around the world about what's happening?
I think this is a very important question. Unfortunately, Israel's sitting on a volcano. And what I mean by that is all these attacks that have been happening over the year and a half has gotten to the point where I'm concerned that an attack inside of Israel that's linked to the West Bank militant group is going to spur an operation, an Israeli military operation in areas such as the northern West Bank. And that's something everybody wants to avoid.
The IDF released new images of what it says are rocket launchers right next to children's schools in the Gaza Strip. The satellite images reportedly show the weapons near 3 separate schools, housing more than 1,000 Palestinian children. Israel's military has long accused the terror group Hamas of using children as human shields and digging tunnels to transport weapons and fighters in civilian areas. The photos were released a week after the UN announced it found a tunnel beneath one of the schools it sponsors in Gaza. It was a day meant to show that Israeli citizens, as well as soldiers, face potentially deadly threats every day. Paul Strand has that story.
This peaceful-looking little kibbutz is actually in danger of having dozens of deadly rocket or mortar shells rain down on it at any moment. When terrorists across the border in Gaza launch these surprise attacks, the citizens of Kibbutz Narim face possible death in a matter of seconds. Adele Ramers lived here for decades.
From the moment we hear the red alert, we have between 0 to 10 seconds before we hear the explosion of the rocket. And that's the amount of time that we have to get to someplace safe.
Raymer showed more than 100 Christian journalists from around the world where these attacks come from within Gaza, just a little over a mile past this fence, which is why each home has a safe room inside and outside shelters are spread around here and nearby kibbutzim. Mikhail Yuziyahu says imagine the trauma for the children who sing of their terror during attacks.
Let's hurry up to the safe room. Let's hurry up, because it's dangerous outside. My heart is pounding, boom, boom, boom. My body is shaking, doom, doom, doom.
That's the terror coming from above. But there was a whole other terror coming from below when the Israelis began to find dozens of tunnels Hamas had dug from Gaza to below these kibbutzim.
There's a whole web of tunnels under our feet. And imagine being in New York and a terrorist popping up from a sewer all of a sudden and spraying the people all around with machine gun fire.
The Israeli military scrambles from this base and forward post to strike back against such attacks. And they've built their own facsimiles of a Gazan tunnel and town to train in.
So here we are gathered with the world's media along the border with Gaza, going into a replica of an actual tunnel built by the terrorists to reach into Israel. And here we go, into the tunnel. The Israelis have found tunnels that go for hundreds and hundreds of yards. And sometimes the terrorists have had battles right inside these tunnels with the IDF soldiers. Imagine trying to fight in quarters this tight.
Local Commander General Benzi Gruber wanted to meet these Christian journalists to rebut charges Israeli troops commit atrocities against Arab civilians, charges leveled by news media and activists who appear much more sympathetic to the Arab attackers than the Israeli defenders. Gruber called on these journalists to publish or broadcast only facts, not false charges.
And you need a lot of courage and a lot of knowledge to stand up and say, no, this is not the truth.
Israeli citizens get angry at the hypocrisy of it all.
The propaganda from the other side who shoot themselves, civilians. I mean, all the bombing, all the rockets we get from Gaza, they're aimed all to civilians.
Meanwhile, back at the military base,
near the Gaza border, the Israeli Defense Forces have built an entire fake Gaza village so that they can practice maneuvering and fighting inside of it. And on the walls, they put things that would look like maybe terrorist art. And you might think they'd charge through the doorways or the windows, but they're afraid they'd all be booby-trapped. So what instead is they just blow holes in the walls to get inside.
Gruber wanted to make sure the journalists saw all this, but more as well.
Much of what the Israeli Armed Forces does involves jets and rockets and artillery, things like that. But for a day like this, when the international media is gathered at this base, the general decided to show off just a good old-fashioned tank.
He charged the journalists with this tank, then hopped out and invited them to jump on board. But none of the show and tell was meant to take away from the sober message. The Jewish nation is never free of threat from enemies out to destroy them.
They have a saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And what this means, in other words, that there will be no more Jews here, that we will throw them into the sea.
So Israel must have a strong army. We're surrounded with enemies all around us.
The main difference between the U.S. military and the Israeli military is the fact that the U.S. military for the last few years has fought far away, thousands of miles away, sometimes hard to know what they're fighting for. But for the Israeli military, they're fighting for their homes. They're fighting for their relatives' lives.
And for the very existence of their nation. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from near the Gaza border.
Those journalists Paul referred to came to Jerusalem for the 6th Annual Christian Media Summit. But they did more than listen to speeches. They listened to Israelis and saw the land for themselves. This annual gathering began as a forum to share values and concerns between Jewish people and Christians in the media.
It's important, first of all, because Jesus was a Jew.
Israel's government press office sponsors the summit and hosted nearly 120 people from more than 25 countries this year.
We need to persuade lots of Christian media to come to Israel, to get to know the Israeli society, because when we have battles and military operation, and even in a peace process period, we need more media word to talk about Israel in a positive way.
At the opening night event, CBN News talked with visitors about why they attended the summit.
Norway is a country where we have a lot of lies produced by the media about Israel. So what we are called to do is just to speak the truth.
It's bringing together television professionals and execs from around the world, right here in the epicenter of it all in Israel, to talk about updates, what's going on, how can we build stronger relationships with Israel.
Some noted the importance for journalists to see and learn about Israel firsthand, rather than basing decisions on other sources.
If you stay in your country and you keep watching your national or international news network, they will not tell you the truth about the region. The only way to connect with the reality is to come.
We still need some voice in the East African region, in Africa, to tell the news of what is going on in Israel, because there's so much negative media out there. So it's good when you come, experience it, and then you go back and tell the story of Israel.
During the summit, participants had the opportunity to learn the latest in Israeli innovations, the danger Iran poses to the Jewish state, and the growth of anti-Semitism. An older battle than even the danger of a nuclear Iran is the ancient scourge of anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jews.
Historically, what starts with anti-Semitism ends up denying the rights and causing terror for many, many different minorities. So that's why this summit is so important, to lift our voices, to speak out against anti-Semitism, and to declare that racism in any form is unacceptable.
They also had the opportunity to visit an IDF military base, see a replica of a Gaza city, and tour models of Hamas tunnels where Israeli soldiers now train to fight and defend Israel. Journalists also heard from Israelis in Nirim, a community close to the Gaza perimeter fence. Residents told them about living under the threat of rockets. And since these are Christian journalists, they felt the need to learn about God's perspective on Israel and the Middle East.
It's important to understand what God is doing now in Israel and the Middle East, and what are the best way to reflect this through our media channel that we have in Romania.
So we can then report more of the news of what's happening with a greater insight, so that it can encourage more people to pray and intercede into some of the very tough political situations that Israel faces.
Coming up, as the uprising in Iran enters its third month, the Iranian authorities intensify the crackdown, this time with execution orders. The international community is reacting with outrage and horror at reports that Iran is publicly executing protesters arrested during nationwide demonstrations against the regime. Activists warn that Iranian officials have sentenced at least a dozen people to death in closed-door hearings. Iran has accused the detainees of attacking security officials and crimes against Allah. Washington called the trials a sham.
The regime has rounded up and detained thousands of people for their involvement in these protests. Many of them now face harsh sentences, including the death penalty and sham trials that lack any due process. We denounce this draconian treatment in the strongest terms. These harsh sentences, and now the first public execution at least, are meant to intimidate Iran's people. They're meant to suppress dissent, and they simply just underscore how much Iran's leadership actually fears its own people.
Iran is trying to quell protests that began following the death of a woman in police custody after she was arrested for allegedly violating the country's strict Islamic dress code. A United Nations Council dedicated to gender equality voted to oust Iran over its treatment of women and violent crackdown on protesters. In light of the sobering news out of Iran, composer and Middle East instrument master Israeli Yaron Cherniak shares how he is composing for the Iranian underground church. We blurred some video for safety reasons. Julie Stahl has more.
So you're very connected to this region. Your music's very connected.
For some reason, it was just on my heart so much to develop and produce and widen the repertoire of worship music in Farsi, in classical forms. So first of all, what you do is to learn about the culture, about the history, about the background of the culture, background of Iran, What is a Shia Muslim country? What is in terms of culture, of feasts? What they do there? What about their poetry? You have to learn their poetry, their classic forms. And then, of course, as a musician, I started to dig in their music tradition. So that's the idea, is to speak the language of the people, their rhymes, their rhythms, their poetry, their language, not to touch it, not to try to westernize it. And the goal is to reach out to traditional societies, especially in Iran, where the underground church facing persecution and oppression by the regime, the Islamic regime. And sometimes in those traditional societies, Western worship music, sometimes it's almost an obstacle for the traditional person. When he listened to that, he shut the door immediately. For them, their sound, it represents something, and a traditional sound represents their authenticity, their identity, their history. Their history is connected to something much more ancient than the rock music or jazz music or any other, you name it. Their music is very well rooted in their past. But what I do is to really send them, to use it as a way to communicate with them, to say, I'm not trying to change your culture is amazing. I just want to share with you this love to God and to the Son of God, Yeshua, that this is the way for you to find life and light.
Up next, the IDF beefs up search and rescue training to better save lives and gives a front row seat to the U.S. and other delegations. For the first time in more than 2 years, Israel's military is hosting a large-scale exercise through its search and rescue unit. As Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl shows us, the IDF invited the U.S. and other delegations to participate.
The exercise began with a simulation of a building collapse, similar to what happened to this Miami condominium in June 2021.
The significance of this exercise is implementing the integrated intelligence concept of our unit.
As part of the exercise, the Search and Rescue Unit sought to rescue 100 people. In this simulation, one of the groups extracted 5 people in 24 to 26 hours. According to Reserve Colonel Golan Vach, Israel pulled out 60 in the same amount of time because of the unique tools they use.
So Israel has a unique role to play in the international field by bringing the speed and the Israeli IDF capabilities. We are part of the Israel Defense Force and we rely on its resources. And by using the Israel Air Force, the IDF intelligence, by using Israel's special units combined with our search and rescue capabilities, we bring something very special to the table.
Representatives from international rescue organizations, including the U.S., Panama, Mexico, and Germany, joined about 400 Israeli military personnel, including doctors, engineers, rescuers, and more. To keep the exercise as realistic as possible, professional actors portrayed relatives searching for their loved ones, and even the smell of rotting flesh was added.
Israel sees a great value to save lives everywhere, every time, to each person that is in trouble. Each one of the men and women in my unit are most dedicated to the mission.
Israeli rescuers can reach anywhere in the world in 12 hours. They also helped in Miami, and Vach says the biggest challenge there came in helping surviving family members.
We needed to support them during this mission by knowing that their relatives are already dead, and we could not tell them that we found them. Living with these families for 14 days and nights was the most difficult thing that we faced in Miami.
Overall, he says, The most rewarding thing is knowing they are saving lives.
You're dealing with the most precious things in the world, is saving live people, saving the families by finding their loved ones, and feeling that you represent this organization, the Israeli Defense Force, the State of Israel, and you are doing that well. It makes us proud to wear the Israeli flag on our arms when we are walking in Mexico, Albania, Honduras, Nepal, Haiti, you name it.
Vach calls it a privilege to participate in these exercises, share what they know, and learn from others while sharing the value of saving lives. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blast so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell, reporting from Mount Gerizim. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.